And that is also a tragedy that happens to the public space if you think about it. And these questions of exile, belonging, citizenship, home, are not just questions that stop with the colonial rule. I think those are very important questions that carry over to the post-colonial context that we find ourselves them in also. So I think Sidhwa's work remains relevant for all of us to this day and age.
Thank you. The first novel I read of hers was Crow Eaters, because of course I'm a Parsi and it's about Parsis. It blew my mind that somebody was actually writing a novel about Parsis, given how small the community was. And it's also, if you haven't read it, a very funny novel. But my initial impression of it, and my initial impression of, I think, the early work, was that the characters and the situations that were more contrived and more stereotypical, but in the stereotypes themselves, I think, in the relationships themselves in the novel, I think there's, what comes across to me, rereading, and looking at it again as I did the last 2 weeks, is that there's an affection for her characters that often, when you read characters that are stereotyped in other novels, there is not an affection for those characters, that they're specifically stereotyped to perform a function in the novel, and then that function is done, the character disappears. But I don't think that's true for Babsi. I think that is very much, that what shines through is her affection for all of the people she writes about and all of the characters that she develops. And I think that's also very important. It was also important for me to read a novelist writing about my community, which I had never read before. And people like Rohinton Mistry had, Tales from Firozhabad was still, I think, 5-6 years hence. She was very much the first Parsi to write about Parsis, which I think was also important. But there's a question I asked her many years ago now, and I can't remember when, but I asked her if it was difficult for her to begin writing in English as opposed to, say, Urdu or Gujarati. And the thing she told me was that basically her English was better than either her Urdu or Gujarati, but she could write fluent Gujarati and she could read fluent Gujarati. And she said that the transition into English required her to think differently about the people she was writing about. And it allowed her, the writing in English gave her a bit of a distance and a kind of, not objectivity necessarily, but distance from the world that she was depicting in her novels, so that she could write about these people with a degree of accuracy that she didn't think she could write about them in Gujarati, that the Gujarati writing would end up idiomatically and colloquial in a way that wasn't what she wanted to accomplish. So I thought I would ask all of you, when you began writing, the two of you especially, but also your experience of this, Sabah, was there a dilemma about Urdu, English, what language to use? Is writing in English about South Asia perhaps not, does it require a kind of epistemic shift, or a shift in the way you understand or the way in which meaning works in the context of your narratives?
Who wants to answer first?
Well, you're speaking.
Why not you? Well, I just want to backpedal a moment and go to something you said, Framji, earlier, which is I read an interview of Babsi's about 10 and 12 years ago. It was in Dawn, where she said something to the effect that when Crow Eaters came out, it wasn't, because some of the characters aren't very likable. And that's something else I hope we talk about, is this pressure to have likable characters. And she just, she wrote, she was really blunt, and it was hilarious, but it was also not very flattering. And so it was not well liked by the Parsi community, and it wasn't actually embraced till it did well in the West, which is so typical. So, here when and it connects with this question of English, is that when we write in English, then we are sort of put in this bracket of writing for the West. But then when the West gives accolades or praise or even just publishes the book, then people here sit up and take it seriously. So there's just kind of a sort of a conflict that I think is ongoing. And I think that when I started my very first book, I began a long time ago. It was in the 90s. I had been writing it. I didn't know if it would turn into a book. I just was writing. I didn't know if it would ever find a publisher. But I do know that I was always pretty private about what I was doing. I didn't talk about my stories. I didn't share with anybody. I didn't. And I think perhaps in retrospect, some of that was because I expected criticism for writing in English. I expected to not be taken seriously because I was writing in English. I expected to not be taken seriously because I'm a woman also writing and writing in English. My education in Pakistan was, I'm a convent girl. I went to St. Joseph's, so it was an English language. That wasn't my choice. It's just sort of what happened, and yet you're kind of judged for it at the same time. So I think that for me, the reason I wrote in English was because it just felt the most natural. It's not that I was thinking of the market or thinking about anything consciously. It was just what I could do. Had I tried to write in Urdu, which, I write with my hand, and I really like the Urdu script. So I always grew up scribbling in many different scripts. I used to live abroad as a child. I mean, I even used to sort of noodle in Japanese script and write different scripts. And I love calligraphy. So I would play with scripts, but they were not stories. I knew that these letters and scribbles were not amounting to narrative, and narrative is what moved me, and story and characters and place and geographies, and this was always what I wanted to do. So it was just natural for me to write in English. There was no other reason than that it was my first language, even if it wasn't my mother tongue or my father tongue.
I want to go back to the Crow Eaters, because I was looking through the Bapsi Sitwa omnibus, which is all the novels. And just before the novel of the Crow Eaters, there's an author's note. And I don't know, and Framji, I know you have a copy of it. I don't know whether that was in the original version that was published, because there's an author's note that basically, it's a sort of an apology of saying, look, the Parsi community, it's wonderful. I love them all. This is a satire. And it's in the original. That to me is really interesting because, because of deep-rooted admiration for my community and an enormous affection for a few eccentricities, this work of fiction has been a labor of love. The nature of satire, and then she goes on to explain the nature of satire. And it's interesting because it's in that author's note, you see the extraordinary anxiety of doing this thing. But what is, to me, the mark of a very fine novelist, you do not see that anxiety in the novel. She isn't writing the novel as though she's thinking, what if people get angry with me? You cannot write a novel if you think, what if people get angry? Because your readers will smell it. They'll smell your cowardice, and they'll smell your fear, and they'll smell that there are things you should have put in and you decided not to because someone might get annoyed. And I admire that so much in her, that even though she knew, and the author's note tells us, she knew that a lot of people would not be happy, and that they would think this is a collection of stereotypes, that you are from a small community and those stereotypes exist, and why are you? And she just decided, this is the novel I want to write, and this is the vein in which I want to write, which is the vein of satire, which does deal in what looks like stereotype, and in fact exaggerates the stereotype even further, with the wish that everyone will be in on the joke and recognize the affection in it. I find the author's note very moving now. I find the fact that she wrote the book and then wanted to say, look, please don't take this the wrong way. Recognize this for what it is. But she wrote it, and there's not a whiff of self-censorship. It is a gloriously bawdy, funny book that doesn't pull its punches. And again, to be a Pakistani woman at that point in life, writing that openly in this bawdy fashion is also, I think, really something to stop and talk about and think about.
Yeah, I think partly because the Parsi community is insular, very insular, and very private, and doesn't like to talk about or show itself
Yeah,
publicly
yeah.
because of any number of reasons, including fear,
Yeah.
especially increasing fear, beginning with the Zia years. I mean, my experience of it has always been, no, don't talk about that, don't bring them here, don't show that, don't do this, don't do that. And for her to present it in a book, I think was very, in a novel at that, was I
Yeah.
think very scary for Parsis.
Yeah.
Not that they necessarily didn't like the book or didn't find it funny, but there was a kind of fear involved in that kind of
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah, and I think for that reason, although Ice Candy Man is my favorite of hers, I do think The Crow Eaters is the bravest.
Yes.
I think it took something quite extraordinary, and also again that determination of, and maybe a willfulness of, well, this is what I want to write,
Right.
and I'm just going to go and do it. But I think we can't underestimate what an act of courage it was to do that. I still have, young Pakistani women a lot of time will say, well, I want to write, but, what will my family think? I want to write these things, but I wrote just one sentence about things that happen every day and I see every day, and my mother saw it and said, you mustn't write it. This is something that is so large in this country, whether you are Parsi or Muslim or Hindu or Christian, the sense of particularly of what women should be writing about, And Babsi, I think page 2, we have genitalia, And it's just, I think people could do with reading Babsi and saying, actually, you want to write about the world as it is, write about the world as it is.
Seva?
Adding to this conversation, I remember reading an essay by her, Why and How I Write. I think it's in the new anthology Landscapes of Writing that came out, and it was very insightful to read about her, other than what was just talked about, her bravery and commitment, but also perseverance. Her novels got rejected multiple times from multiple publishers abroad, but she still persevered in her vision, and her artistic integrity continued. She wasn't looking to write something formulaic. She wasn't making a product. She was remaining true to her vision. And circuitously, it found the kind of respect and recognition that the work required. But I think it touches upon larger questions, like you said, about the politics of reception. So it's not just writing, as we have, our prolific writers here, I think, who also deal with these questions. Even in terms of scholarship, are you producing a product that caters to mainstream tastes or expectations, or do you remain true to your vision? And I feel the work finds its way. It's a harder route, of course. It's a much more challenging route to remain kind of committed to your vision. But I think Sidva was very inspiring the ways that she didn't give up, and she didn't really compromise on artistic integrity. It was more about the love of writing, and which is why we're here talking about her legacy today, because she continues to inspire all of us.
Yeah, and just to add, I think Crow Eaters comes out of one of the things that I remember when I was younger, but she more than I remember, the Parsi Natak and the Parsi Nataks that were performed in Pakistan, in Karachi and in Lahore, and Indian companies that used to come and perform here. So it wasn't just Pakistani actors and Pakistani theater companies, but Indian companies and the Parsi Natak has a long history in South Asia, beginning in the 19th century. And so one of the things she says is that in fact, the novel, that she imagined the novel as a Parsi Natak in some ways, and that she imagined those scenes taking place on stage, which allowed her to write it in its particularity and specificity, which she might not have been able to do had she just been sort of conjuring these things out of thin air. But I think you're right. I think it's a brave novel, very brave novel.
Pranji, do you know why the writing stopped at a certain point?
She was very ill. So she was ill, then she wasn't, then she was better, she recovered, then she was ill again.
Right.
When I last saw her, not the time in Karachi, but in the US, was I think 2007 or 2008, where she was speaking at a screening of Water, actually, with Deepa Mehta at Yale, and Sarah Soleri had invited them to screen the film and then to discuss it. and she was in the middle of illnesses, so she had recovered. I asked her how she was feeling. She said, "I've recovered, but I don't know whether I will." And she was also in remission, so she also had cancer at one point. She was in remission. I'm not sure if it came back or not. I haven't been in, I mean, I wasn't in touch with her over the past 10 years, so.
So one thing I'd like to add, since we're talking about health, I mean, one thing that Ice Candy Man also stands out to me is, you know, Lenny, like Bapsi, had polio as a child. And so this book has a differently abled child narrator who's Parsi, who's bearing witness to these, you know, immense events that she doesn't understand. And at first she's just baffled, but then she becomes a player. And I mean, one thing that really moves me when I go back to that book is how there was so many, in terms of identity and in terms of, you know, just coming back to how when you pick up a pen and you start, you just don't know where you're going. And it is an act of faith. It's an act of great courage. And for me, it's also an act of innocence, because you just trust. You trust something. You trust the pen. You trust the paper. You trust the ink. And she also then wrote about people who were differently abled, and in a way that, you know, it wasn't what the book is about. It's about many things, but it was centered. And the Lenny being coddled, you know, she comes from a wealthy background, so she has the advantage of class. Even if she's a child and she inadvertently plays a horrible part in what happens to her Hindu ayah, she's got her privilege. And so she's writing about all these things. There's so many angles. There's the privilege of class. Then there's the fact that she's in some ways been more privileged because she's been differently able. She hasn't been allowed to do certain things, but that also means that she's got a certain freedom and she plays around. She can only play so much because she can't run around like the other children. And she's bearing witness to this immense historical event. And she's Parsi, and she's witness to Hindu-Muslim strife. So her lens was, you know, nobody else has ever had that lens.
And many of the incidents in the novel are actually autobiographical in that she experienced those things firsthand. The body by the side of the road, that actually happened to her. The sort of sectarian conflicts that happened within the home and outside the home, those were things that she actually experienced and saw. So, I mean, a lot of the book is autobiographical, a thinly veiled autobiography.
And it's very hard to do. I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting that I think for all of us, that is the one we think is the best of the novels. It's so hard, I think, to do the child narrator telling you these really difficult moments of history, because on one time she has to maintain the kind of perspective of a child who really doesn't know what is going on, and at the same time, we as the readers have to know what's going on. It's not a simple or straightforward thing at all to manage. And again, even in that book, there are moments of humor and there's lightness. And she weaves in and out between the lightness and the darkness, I think, very effectively. And I think, again, you know, I was looking at it in a kind of, I was thinking I would give this to students to say, here's one way of doing a child narrator where you have the older voice looking back and remembering the child, so that there are the language is not that of a child, but the perspective is that of a child. It's a very clever way of sort of, you know, you could say having your cake and eating it, but it's done so well. It's such a thoughtful and intelligent way of saying, how am I going to make this work, that it is a child, but it's not only a child. I think it's very smartly done.
We are getting close to time. Would people have questions to ask our panelists? Yes, please. Do you have mics, Sammy? Great.
My name is Chand Rizvi, and I've come from one of Saraiki districts, Laya. As we are talking about Sidhwa's legacy, And as Shamsi has already mentioned, that Croetus is one of her bravest novels. So, thinking of Sidhwa's legacy, I am asking this very question of Khan and Shamsi. Which ones are your bravest novels and how?
Isn't that, no, why always me first?
Because I
I mean, isn't that for readers to say, though? I mean, how are we going to say that this is my bravest book?
Okay, can I ask you this? Which was the scariest novel to write?
Scariest. Well, I mean, the last book I wrote, The Miraculous True History of Nomi Ali, it, in some ways, maybe that one, because it took so long. I started it actually before I wrote any of my other novels. So I have 5, and this one I began first. But it took so long because I was writing historical fiction. And I think that's why, this topic of Bapsi is moving for me, is because she was the first Pakistani novelist that I read who wrote historical fiction. And then I tried it myself with book 1, and I didn't have the material. You have to do a lot of research. I didn't live through the time that I was writing about. That's why I call it historical fiction. Otherwise, it would have been contemporary. This was a pre-partition novel, and it was set in the Andaman Islands during the Second World War. And it was about the British occupation, the Kalapani, the penal colony, but also Japanese. And the Japanese had torn up all the documents before leaving. So, and the British, I couldn't access the material till I went to the British Library, which was many years later. So for a very long time, I had a primary character. Before Nomi, there was the prisoner. And I trusted my relationship with her. But I was writing fiction based on real events, unlike my other books where everything was just made up. This was based on real events. And so there was a real fear there that I had to do right by this history that others have lived through. But I also have to do right by myself because I'm a fiction writer and my tool is primarily language. And I have to be true to that process. I have to be true to the making of fictional characters, even if the events are based on fact. So I had to juggle a lot, and I didn't think anybody would be interested in this time and place. And I didn't think it would be published. And I kept on. I wrote, another book and then another book and then another book, and I kept going back to this book, which I only completed, this was my most recent book. So probably scary is the better way to put it for me, because I was scared that even though I believed in it, I didn't know if it would matter to anybody else.
The one I get told is brave is Home Fire. It required no particular bravery to write it. Because when it's I don't know what people mean when they keep saying that's brave. The one that was scary was Burnt Shadows, and I think for similar reasons, which was I had always written novels that were set in Karachi in a world that was very, very familiar to me. And then Burnt Shadows starts in 1945 in Nagasaki, the day the bomb falls, and then goes to Delhi at partition, and then moves on and on. And it was that, as a writer, I think when you're doing things that you haven't done before, or when you're doing things that require different kinds of responsibilities. So that felt far more terrifying than anything before or since. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Bina Sarwar, and thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I have a question about, I don't know if anybody has the answer to this, but one of her books that really fascinated me was The Bride, which is a very small book, and it's set in a place that she wasn't familiar with, and it's based on a kind of a true incident that she came across. And then I remembered there was a film that was called, I forget the film, but it had exactly that incident in it that she describes in The Bride of a woman being forced into marriage, and then I forget the name of the film, but anybody see that think it was maybe it was Khuda Ke Liye, maybe, or something. But anyway, I was just wondering if any of you knew anything more about that book and how she, because it's a really, it's like a little novelette actually. It's like really small.
It was her first book, wasn't it?
Pardon?
Wasn't
The
The Bride
Bride?
her first book?
No, second book.
I thought
Well,
she'd
she
written
wrote
it-
it
yeah, she
before,
wrote
but
it-
she published it
Yeah,
after.
so it was her first book.
So it was her first book. That's right. Yeah. That's right.
I don't know. I don't know very much about.
Honestly, it's the one novel I have not read, so I can't. Sabah?
Oh, there's a big sign saying "Time Up."
Time up already? Okay. To just answer this question, Sabah, do you have any insight about that?
We have no insight about The Bride, Veena.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, Famji.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you to the audience.
Oh, we have to sit.
Thank you.
Standing group.
Where did she go? Are we ready? Oh, we have to stand in a group. Should we use one of her? Oh, okay. Here's the omnibus.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated for the screening of the film In Flames. But before that, please let me welcome Bakhtawar Mazhar and Wajdan Shah, two actors who starred in the film In Flames. It is the debut feature by writer and director Zarar Khan. It premiered at Directors Fortnight at the Cannes Film Festival in 2023, won the Golden Yusuf for Best Film at the Red Sea Film Festival, and was Pakistan's submission to the Oscars in 2023.
How do we turn it on?
हेलो
Hello.
सलाम आदाब आज यहाँ पर इन फ्लेम्स के लिए बात करते हुए स्पेशल भी है और थोड़ा सा अनसेटलिंग भी है, क्योंकि मुझे लगता है कि यहाँ जो लोग बैठे हुए हैं उन्होंने इन फ्लेम्स नहीं देखी हुई। फिल्म जब नहीं देखी हुई हो तो एक्सक्यूज़ मी, कैन हैव यू हैव थोड़ा सा यहाँ पे अगर
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated.
जब फिल्म नहीं देखी हो तो थोड़ा सा बात करते हुए होता है कि हम क्या बात करें उन लोगों के साथ जिन्होंने अभी फिल्म नहीं देखी, हमारे कैरेक्टर से वो अभी अनजान हैं। मैं हूँ बख्तावर मज़हर। ये फिल्म प्राइमरीली माँ बेटी की कहानी है, जिसको पता नहीं क्यों हॉरर का जॉनरा दे दिया, हालांकि मुझे लगता है कि ये साइकोलॉजिकल थ्रिलर ज़्यादा है। इसमें बहुत ज़्यादा थीम्स हैं जो हमारे आपके दिल के करीब हैं, और कराची शहर इस फिल्म का एक कैरेक्टर ही समझ लीजिए, क्योंकि जितना हम लोगों के कैरेक्टर्स इंपॉर्टेंट थे इस फिल्म में, उतना ही कराची की इम्पोर्टेंस है। तो ये शहर, आपके शहर की कहानी है। वजदान का एक बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग और इम्पॉर्टेंट पार्ट है, वजदान शाह। हम दोनों थिएटर एक्टर्स हैं, ट्रेंड टीचर भी रह चुके हैं, अभी भी हैं, और ये हम दोनों की पहली फ़ीचर फिल्म थी। फिल्म डिड रियली वेल, जिसकी हमें उम्मीद नहीं थी। वी मेड इट टू कैंस, वी वेंट टू डायरेक्टर्स फोर्टनाइट। बहुत साल बाद, कोई 20 साल बाद कोई पाकिस्तानी फ़िल्म उस कैटेगरी में कैन फिल्म फेस्टिवल में पहुंची। उसके बाद फिल्म वाज आल्सो पार्ट ऑफ टोरंटो इंटरनेशनल फिल्म फेस्टिवल टिफ कनाडा में। उसके बाद वी आल्सो मेड इट टू रेड सी फिल्म फेस्टिवल इन सऊदी अरब, जहां पे हम लोगों ने गोल्डन यूसर, जो कि मेन प्राइज़ था, अगेंस्ट सो मेनी अदर एंट्रीज वी वन दैट। मेरे ख्याल में पाकिस्तान के लिए बहुत ही एक अच्छा लम्हा था, क्योंकि उसमें इंडियन फिल्म्स भी और भी उनकी अपनी अरबिक फिल्म्स और भी तरह की कई फिल्में थीं जो कि बहुत ही अच्छी बनी हुई थी। तो हम लोग थोड़े से हैरान भी थे और ख़ुश भी थे जब हमने ये मेन प्राइज़ जीता। फ़िल्म के बारे में मज़ीद बात करने से पहले मैं वजदान से पूछना चाहूँगी, वजदान अभी तक तो उन लोगों ने फ़िल्म नहीं देखी, लेकिन जब देखेंगे तो आप कुछ बताना चाहेंगे कि आप इस फिल्म का हिस्सा कैसे बने?
अस्सलामुअलैकुम, थैंक यू बख्तावर, एंड आई एम रियली ग्लैड कि मैं यहाँ पर आप सबके सामने मौजूद हूँ और इन फ्लेम्स यहाँ पे KLF में दिखाई जा रही है। तो ऑफ कोर्स एक ऑडिशन कॉल हुई थी, जैसे होनी चाहिए सारी फिल्मों की, और उसमें मैं बिल्कुल उसका हिस्सा बनना चाहता था, लेकिन मुझे ज़रा सी देर हो गई थी। तो मैंने रिकॉर्डिंग कर ली थी, लेकिन फॉर सम रीज़न सिलेक्शन नहीं हो सकी थी मेरी वीडियोस की। तो माय वाइफ आफरीन सहर, उन्होंने फ़ोर्स किया, उन्होंने कहा नहीं आप भेजो, ज़रूर भेजो, इवन अगर डेडलाइन ख़त्म हो गई है, आगे निकल गई है, आप ज़रूर भेजें। तो कुछ 2-3 घंटे डिले पे मैंने वो अपनी वीडियोस ज़रार को भेजी, ईमेल की, फिर फाइनली आई गॉट सिलेक्टेड एंड आई एम रियली ग्लैड। और कहानी के हवाले से एक चीज़ ये भी मैं ज़रूर बताना चाहूँगा कि फ़िल्म, हैरत की बात है, शुरू मेरे जो है गड़बड़ करने की वजह से होती है, एंड यू आर देयर एंड आई एम अमेजिंगली कि हम बख्तावर और मैं थिएटर, जबकि हम बहुत टाइम से करते आए हैं, पहली हमारी फ़िल्म शेयरिंग, स्क्रीन शेयरिंग है कि हम स्क्रीन पर और पहली मरतबा एक साथ काम कर रहे हैं। सो या दैट इज़ हाउ आई गॉट सिलेक्टेड। और ऑफ कोर्स जो कास्टिंग डायरेक्टर थे हमारे मोहम्मद अली हाशमी, जो एक्ट भी कर रहे हैं इसमें, उनका फ़ोन आया, उन्होंने कहा कि भाई एक है, किरदार है और फादर फिगर हैं, एंड या सो
मैं यहाँ पे ज़रूर मेंशन करूँगी कि ज़रार ख़ान, जिनको आप लोग शायद यहाँ पे लोकली इतना ज़्यादा इस फिल्म के बाद ही जाना गया, अमेजिंग यंग टैलेंट, अमेजिंग डायरेक्टर, और उनका विज़न बिल्कुल डिफरेंट था। और उन्होंने और उनकी प्रोड्यूसर अनम अब्बास, और फिर वहाँ से इनके जो कोलैबोरेशन में ईशान जोशी थे कनाडा से, उन लोगों ने बहुत मेहनत की इस फिल्म पर। और मुझे लगता है कि जो पूरी टीम थी हमारी प्रोड्यूसर्स की और एक्टर्स की, इन्होंने एक नई कहानी एक नए अछूते अंदाज में बयान की है। शायद कहानी इतनी नई नहीं भी है, लेकिन जो थीम्स इसमें बयान किए गए हैं वो हम सब के घरों में मौजूद हैं। फॉर एग्जांपल मेरे दिल के करीब जिसकी वजह से मैं इस फिल्म का पार्ट बनी थी वो ये था कि माँ और बेटी का रिलेशनशिप। हमारे यहाँ हम माएँ अपने बच्चों को दिन रात नज़रों के सामने रखते हैं, उनके खाने पीने की, उनकी सेहतों की बहुत फिक्र करते हैं, लेकिन हम उनसे बात नहीं करते। बहुत कुछ होते हुए भी वो इनविजिबल रहते हैं, और वो जो कम्युनिकेशन गैप्स बनते हैं जिसकी वजह से फिर वो ट्रॉमाज और वो जो मसाइल पैदा होते हैं जो बहुत अंदर दबते दबते नासूर बन जाते हैं, ये फिल्म उस पर बात करती है। ये फिल्म उस पर बात करती है कि कैसे एक माँ अपनी बेटी की हीरो बनती है और कैसे एक बेटी अपनी माँ की हीरो बनती है, और एक दूसरे को मुसीबतों से निकालने में उनको किसी तीसरे की नहीं, सिर्फ एक दूसरे की ही मदद दरकार होती है। तो ये बहुत अपलिफ्टिंग फिल्म है इस लिहाज से। और ज़ाहिरी बात है उसमें एक जो साइकोलॉजिकल हॉरर का एलिमेंट है जो कि पाकिस्तान में इस तरह की फिल्में नहीं बनती हैं, तो वो बड़ा दिलचस्प तजुर्बा रहा। वैज़ान, हम इससे पहले कि
मैं आपसे एक सवाल पूछना ज़रूर चाहूँगा कि कराची को उमूमन मैंने मेरी फिल्म मेकर से या जो हमारे विजुअल स्टडीज़ के स्टूडेंट्स ग्रेजुएट हुए हैं वो कभी कभार अक्सर बल्कि कहते हैं कि कराची को कराची की तरह हमने शूट ही नहीं करना। तो इस फिल्म में जो कराची एज अ कैरेक्टर इन फ्लेम्स में जो ज़रार ने और पूरी हमारी टीम ने जिस तरह कैप्चर किया है, उसके बारे में अगर आप कुछ ज़रूर मज़ीद थोड़ी कहानी पर ज़रा रोशनी डालने चाहें तो।
कराची रोशनियों का शहर है, खूबसूरत शहर है जो कभी सोता नहीं है। काफ़ी अरसे तक बदकिस्मती से ये दहशतगर्दी का भी शिकार रहा। सियासी शहर है और बहुत ज़्यादा लसानी ग्रुप्स का शहर है, लेकिन कराची में जब कहीं पे ट्रॉमाज हो तो जो घुटन होती है वो उस पर बात बहुत कम होती है। ख़ास तौर पे ख़वातीन को लेकर हमारे यहाँ जो लेजिस्लेशन है, जो क़वानीन हैं, वो ख़वातीन को सपोर्ट नहीं करते। कहना नहीं चाहिए, लेकिन हमारे काफ़ी हद तक मुआशरे मज़हब वग़ैरह में भी ख़वातीन की इतनी सपोर्ट नहीं है जितनी मर्दों में है। वो सब बातों को लेके इस पे जो बात जिस तरह से की गई है उसमें आपको अपने ही शहर की घुटन हर सीन हर फ्रेम में इतनी ज़्यादा महसूस होगी कि आपको लगेगा कि हाँ, ये हमारी ही कहानी है और ये हमसे ही निकली है और इसको हम ही सुना सकते हैं, कोई दूसरा नहीं सुना सकता, इसको हम ही समझ सकते हैं। एक और बात मैं कहना चाहूँगी, पहली दफ़ा बता रही हूँ जो कि इससे पहले नहीं हुई, कि अक्सर मेरे दोस्त मुझसे कहते हैं कि इतनी फ़िल्म के बारे में इंटरनेशनली हमने सुना कि डिड सो वेल, लेकिन हम नहीं देख पाए क्योंकि ये आई लगी सिनेमा में लेकिन चली गई। तो मैं आज ये बताना चाह रही हूँ कि खुशकिस्मती से बिगिन एक स्ट्रीमिंग प्लेटफॉर्म है हमारा अपना ही लोकल, और अब ये फ़िल्म आप बिगिन पर देख सकेंगे अपने घरों में बैठ के। तो आप भी जानिए और अपने दोस्तों और फैमिली को भी बताइए, अगर जो लोग यहाँ आज नहीं आ पाए वो इन फ्लेम्स डायरेक्टेड बाय ज़रार खान देख सकेंगे बिगिन पर।
अच्छा, पैरेलल सिनेमा जो पाकिस्तान में अब शुरू हो रहा है और कुछ टाइम से जॉयलैंड, इन फ्लेम्स और मज़ीद और फिल्म्स आ रही हैं, इनकी क्या जगह है हमारे इंडस्ट्री में? अगर आप प्लीज़
देखिए,
और
हमारे
क्यों होनी चाहिए ऐसी फिल्म्स हमारे एज एन एक्टर? क्योंकि हम बहुत सारी मेन स्ट्रीम कमर्शियल सिनेमा मैंने किया हुआ है, लेकिन एट द सेम टाइम इस तरह की फिल्में, इस तरह की कहानियाँ क्यों सामने आनी चाहिए और फिर इंटरनेशनल उसकी रीच किस तरह बढ़ जाती है?
आप ये गलत इंसान से पूछ रहे हैं। हम जो थिएटर के लोग हैं हम तो कुछ और तरीके से सोचते हैं, कहानी कुछ और तरीके से बयान करते हैं। हमारे काम में नाम और पैसा कुछ नहीं होता, लेकिन पैशन होता है, लेबर ऑफ लव है हमारे लिए थिएटर और इस तरह के प्रोजेक्ट्स। लेकिन मैं समझती हूँ कि हम खुशकिस्मत हैं कि फिर भी हमारा टीवी बहुत फ्लोरिश कर रहा है, हमारा टीवी दुनिया भर में जाना जा रहा है और उसको वही जगह मिल रही है जो कि वो डिज़र्व करता है। फ़िल्म इंडस्ट्री बदकिस्मती से हमारी वो जगह नहीं बना पाई, उसकी कई वजूहत हैं, लेकिन बहरहाल इस तरह की कहानियों की जो आपने बात की, बहुत जगह है, बहुत गुंजाइश है, क्योंकि यही कहानियाँ हमारे दरमियान में से उठी हैं और अगर उसको सही तरह से उनको बयान किया जाए, बताया जाए, सुनाया जाए, तो अब मेरे ख़्याल में जिस तरह से लोग OTT प्लेटफॉर्म्स देखने लगे हैं, वेब सीरीज़ देखने लगे हैं, अब जिस तरह से समझ बढ़ी है, जिस तरह से कंडीशनिंग हो रही है कि एक तरह का टीवी या फिल्म करना, लेकिन एक तरह का टीवी या फिल्म या कहानी देखना, तो अब वो आ गया है हमारे माशरे में और मुझे लगता है कि इस तरह की और बहुत सारी फिल्में बननी चाहिए। हम ज़्यादा वक्त नहीं लेंगे आप लोगों का।
मैं सिर्फ ये कहना चाहूँगा कि आई एम रियली प्राउड कि जहाँ मेरे फादर बैठा करते थे, आई एम सिटिंग ऑन द स्टेज, सो थैंक यू सो मच। आई होप यू एंजॉय द फिल्म। आई होप जो इसमें मैसेज है और इस तरह की फ़िल्म ज़रूर यहाँ पे बने और मज़ीद कहानियाँ क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ भरी हुई हैं। अब एक कोई पत्थर भी उठाते हैं तो कराची में, एंड आई एम ग्लैड कि कराची की ही ये फ़िल्म है क्योंकि हमें यहाँ पे घुटन का महसूस तो होती है, लेकिन एट द सेम टाइम हम सड़कों पे देखते हैं तो इतनी औरतें, इतनी ख़वातीन जो काम करने के लिए निकलती हैं, ये बहुत दूसरे पाकिस्तान के शहरों में हमें बहुत कम नज़र आता है। सो आई एम ग्लैड कि ये कहानी कराची ने ही बताई और हम सब ने मिल के बताई।
बिल्कुल, और एक माँ होने की हैसियत से ये फ़िल्म करते वक्त मुझे जो समझ मिली, जो मुझे एहसास हुआ, जो मुझे एक नया इदराक हुआ, उसके लिए मैं ज़रार और अनम की बहुत ज़्यादा शुक्रगुज़ार हूँ। क्योंकि अगेन आप हम मेरी भी 2 बेटियाँ हैं, हम अपने बच्चों को देखते हैं, उनके घुटने में दर्द हो, उनके गले में दर्द हो तो हम बहुत ज़्यादा तवज्जो देते हैं, लेकिन उनके ज़हन किसी कोने में कोई उलझन हो तो हमें वो पता भी नहीं चलता। मुझे बस ये उम्मीद है कि आज की फ़िल्म देख के अगर आप में से 5 लोगों को भी अगर आप लोग जाएं और अपने सोते बच्चों को एक ख़ास तरह से देख सकें और कल सुबह नाश्ते की टेबल पर उनसे किसी और तरीके से गुफ्तगू कर सकें, तो मुझे ये लगेगा कि हमने कुछ कर दिया और इसका हमने कोई फ़र्ज़ पूरा कर दिया। एक सीन है, एक वकील के ऑफ़िस में मेरा सीन है जो दूसरा वाला, वो मेरी ज़िंदगी का सबसे मुश्किल सीन था और मैं ये सिर्फ थोड़ी सी एक इंट्रीग यहाँ पे देके यहाँ से आपसे रुखसत चाहूँगी कि गौर से देखिएगा। एक मुश्किल सीन था और वो क्यों था वो आप इसको देख के ही समझ पाएंगे कि एक औरत के लिए जब बेहद और हर तरह की बैटल्स चल रही होती हैं तो क्या क्या मुश्किल हो जाता है। थैंक यू सो मच।
बख्तावर, अगर आप ऑडियंस को कास्ट का नाम बता दें प्लीज़।
हाँ जी, थैंक यू सो मच। हमारी कास्ट में आई विश के आज शामिल होती है हमारे साथ रमीशा नवाल, अमेजिंग एक्टर जिन्होंने ज़िंदगी की पहली फ़िल्म की, पहली दफ़ा स्क्रीन पे आई और उन्होंने इससे पहले थिएटर भी बहुत कम किया हुआ था। क्या मज़ेदार खूबसूरत काम किया है, प्लीज़ उनको याद रखिएगा। उसके अलावा हमारे साथ मोहम्मद अली हाशमी हैं जो कि फ़िल्म के कास्टिंग डायरेक्टर भी हैं, फिर ज़ाहिर बात है अदनान शाह टीपू भी हैं और उमर जावेद हैं और भी कई लोग हैं और इन सबको आपने और कहीं आसपास नहीं देखा होगा क्योंकि ये सब नए चेहरे हैं सिवाय टीपू के। लेकिन आप आखिर में अगर ये सोचते हुए भी चले जाएं कि सब ने मेहनत से मिलके एक मज़ेदार कहानी बनाने की कोशिश की है तो हम समझेंगे कि हमने थोड़ा सा काम किया। थैंक यू सो मच।
थैंक यू।